Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and hosted by me, Israel Smith. Hi, Matt. And
hi, Israel.
Here we are again. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about another one of our favorite properties, the Historic McGovney-Yunker Farm.
Absolutely.
This was a great article from your blog, Matt's Old Mokena, that came out in March of 2021.
Yep, sounds about right.
So as we go through this, I want to remind people to check out Matt's blog too, because that has some great photos of the farm and just some historic photos that are in there that are really worth looking at. So make sure you check that out as well. So Matt, I mean, what do you say about McGovney-Yunker Farm?
There's a lot to be said about it. It's you can basically say that it was the last working farm in Mokena. I mean, there are a couple other places where, the crops are grown and stuff like that. But I think what sets McGovney-Yunker Farm, or simply Yunker Farm, it was known to my generation, is the fact that it was still in operation by the same, or still being worked by the same family that had been a part of it for so many decades. If you look at the whole history of Yunker Farm, there are only two families that have ever owned that property going back to the 1840s.
That's incredible.
It is, yeah. I think it's, you could say that it's Mokena's last farm also, in that it's the last setting where we have farmhouse, dairy barn, the other outbuildings, et cetera, hog shed, all that kind of stuff. And then most of that acreage still with it. Of course, we've got some other farms in Mokena, like, for example, the old Erickson Benson farm on Schoolhouse Road. We've got the farmhouse, we've got their big dairy barn there, maybe a couple other outbuildings, but what had been their farm has been swallowed up by subdivisions. So it's not really like in its setting anymore. We've got the another Yunker farm, the Schweizer-Yunker Farm on 191st Street, which is where some people might know it as the site of Brandau's farm stand, open in the summer.
Was that a relation to? How are that related to?
Yeah, those Yunkers were related to the LaPorte Road Yunkers. So of course, a lot of us would remember Eddie Yunker, who farmed the land there for many years. The Yunkers on 191st Street were his cousins. Let me see here. They would have been, there was Henry Yunker going way back, who was Eddie's half uncle. And then his, I believe Henry's son was Harry Yunker. So it would have been also Eddie's cousin, a relation.
We're really fortunate to still have Yunker Farm as part of Mokena. Be a large part of downtown.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you see that, if that wasn't the case, how that changed, which would have changed the town, how it changed the makeup of our town?
Yeah, if it, in the sense of it not being preserved, we wouldn't have any tangible connection with our agricultural heritage, as Mokena was for most of its existence, aside from being a railroad town, a farm town as well. And once upon a time, you could go in any direction outside of town and just be confronted with farm after farm. And nowadays, 99% of them are gone. You would have no clue that they were ever there. But in Yunker Farm, or McGovney-Yunker Farm, we can drive by, you can check out the buildings and all that stuff, and you can still get a sense of what life used to be like.
Before we get into the story, because you always do reference McGovney-Yunker Farm, you just say that why you make that difference of not just Yunker Farm.
Yeah, I tend to use both the names, at least in a historic sense, if I'm talking, just because I don't want the McGovneys to go forgotten in their history with the farm, because they owned it as far back as the 1840s, had lived there since the 1830s. So they've got about 90 years of association with the property. And there's not too many people around are really aware of them anymore and their connection to the farm. So yeah, I always reference both, this so people are, to make people aware of the whole story.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, this is a very interesting story, and I'm excited to hear it and share it with everybody. So let's get into the story.
Yes, let's. Arising at the crack of dawn, milking cows by hand, herding them into pasture, preparing hay for bedding, and maintaining all the tools of the trade. These are but a select few, a tiny handful of the many responsibilities that a dairy farmer has on his plate for just one day, winter or summer, rain or shine. A farmer must have mechanical and analytical skills, as well as raw strength for repetitive, strenuous tasks. Our village's heritage is purely agricultural, and farms once dotted our community's landscape in every direction one looked. This lifestyle was the everyday existence for so many in Mokena, but now it is totally extinct in our surroundings. There is, however, one place in our midst that can be visited to absorb these old ways. McGovney-Yunker Farm on LaPorte Road is a gleaming jewel in our town and a certified National Historic Landmark to boot. Now frozen in time, this place once abounded with life. Well, the farm and its quaintness remind our 21st century eyes of something far separated from our lives. There is a long, untold story about the history of this old spot, one of real people who lived and loved just like us. As we turn back the pages of history and follow the threads of time, we find the beginning of the story with John and Nancy McGovney, two brave, rugged pioneers who in the spring of 1831 were the first young family of European descent to settle the land where Mokena would later stand. These intrepid explorers made their journey to Illinois in a covered wagon via Adams County, Ohio, with 5 small children in tow, ranging in ages from 10 to 2. After the McGovneys' arrival, 3 more would join the bunch. They carved out a primitive home on the untamed prairie and built a house out of logs hewn from the Hickory Creek timber. They had barely gotten comfortable in their new surroundings when the Black Hawk War broke out in April 1832, an oft-forgotten conflict between Illinois settlers and elements of the Kickapoo, Sauk, and Meskwaki tribes. When news drifted to the McGovneys of the outbreak of hostilities, they immediately packed up their belongings and fled to more thickly populated points in Indiana, it was said, on advice of the friendly Potawatomi who inhabited what would later be Frankfort Township. When the former Ohioans returned to their Illinois home after the war's end that August, they were very pleasantly surprised to find out that their Potawatomi neighbors had tended to their property in their absence, taking care of their animals, and even left unmolested a loaf of bread that was left baking in their haste to escape. The exact spot of John and McGovney's pioneer homestead and where it corresponds to in today's landscape remains a prickly issue. What is definitely known is that John McGovney formally purchased 2 separate 80-acre tracts of land on May 20th, 1841, from the Federal Government Land Office at Chicago, after having squatted on them as a tenant. 11 years later, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad would bisect this property, which enclosed part of the future village of Mokena. With the passage of years, beginning in 1857, ownership of part of this tract began to transfer to John and Nancy McGovney's youngest son, 21-year-old Elisha. Over time, he added onto it, creating the acreage that is today known as the McGovney-Yunker Farm. One of the first white children to be born in the wilds of the yet unformed Frankfort Township on July 29, 1836, Elijah McGovney wed Catherine Van Horn in September 1857. Their union ultimately welcomed 9 children to the world, of which 6 survived to adulthood, namely Teresa, Walter, called Dick, Edward, Ada, George, and Maddie. All of them would become well-known and respected Mokenians. The 1860 Federal Agricultural Census paints a vivid picture of the McGovney farm in this period, giving it a value of about $6,000 or roughly $175,000 in today's currency. No small-time operation, the farm boasted of $100 worth of farming implements and machinery, and 3 horses, 5 milch cows, 13 other cattle, and 6 swine. That year, Elijah McGovney estimated he had harvested 150 bushels of wheat, 400 bushels of Indian corn, about 100 bushels of Irish potatoes, and 40 tons of hay. In this same time frame, the United States was entering a great existential crisis, and the Civil War erupted in the spring of 1861. A little over a year later, after President Lincoln called for 300,000 more men for his army, Elijah McGovney volunteered for duty on August 22, 1862, in the 100th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, the newly organized Will County Regiment. While donning his blue uniform, he served as the unit's wagon master as well as a message carrier. The battles of Stones River, Chickamauga, and Franklin, some of the darkest days in our country's narrative, which stand so starkly on the pages of our history books, were for Elijah McGovney places of intensely personal experience. He survived the war with life and limb in one piece and was mustered out of the Army in June 1865 as a hero of the Union. According to a story passed down in the McGovney family for generations, during his time at war, Elijah had taken under his wing an orphan slave child, and after the end of the conflict, he came to Mokena to the farm where he lived as a member of the family. While his name has disappeared into the mists of time, it has been remembered that after he struck out on his own, he became a successful preacher. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the McGovneys decided to try their fortune in Missouri, and much like his father did a generation before, Elijah and his brood made the tough 3-week journey via a wagon. Years later, his son Dick would recall sleeping nights with his father under the conveyance, armed to the teeth to ward off potential highwaymen. Luck was not in their favor, and 2 years later, the McGovneys came back to their farm just outside Mokena.
Matt, what made them, you think, decide to try to move to Missouri?
You know, that's a good question. And I don't really have a good answer for it. It has not been recorded on the historic record, as it were, what it was that caused them to leave Mokena and go there, although they were not the only family from Mokena to have ventured out to Missouri, of all places, in that time period. So it kind of makes me believe that there must have been something out there that was attractive to people from here, be it an opportunity for more land or some sort of opportunity to increase their own wealth or something like that. There was something that was drawing people there. But yeah, I can think of one other family aside from the McGovneys, the Hackers, who also went to Missouri in this time frame, hung out for a little bit, and then ultimately came back. Oh. Yeah.
Do you know what happened to the farm in the 2 years while they were gone?
I'm not sure of what was happening out at the farm in those years. I could almost imagine that maybe it was rented to somebody else, or there were other members of the McGovney family who lived in the area at the time who may have been taking care of it. But yeah, what exactly was going on the farm in that period? In those 2 years, I'm not really sure. It's kind of a mystery.
In 1841, the McGovneys first bought the 80 acres, and you said after they squatted. Do you know how long they were squatting before they, squatted as renters? But how long before they purchased?
There would have been about 10 years because they got here in 1831, and then the land had gone on the market in Chicago. In 1841, which allowed John McGovney, the family patriarch, to finally buy it. Although that raises a whole other question. I'm not sure if where the McGovneys first settled when they first got here in 1831 was the same homestead that they bought in 1841. Kind of would like to think so, but I have no real historical evidence to back that up.
And in 1860, we have a value of $6,000 for the farm.
Yeah,
which equates to about $175,000 in today's money. You said?
Yeah, according to the source I used, the inflation calculator online. Yeah, that's about what that would equal nowadays.
Interesting, because you probably get a little bit more than that nowadays.
That's kind of what I'm thinking. I mean, especially for the farm at the size it was.
Right.
Yeah. I think they probably could have, yeah.
Any idea what the 1861 is the start of the Civil War?
Yep, 1861.
And where any idea where Mokena was population wise at that point?
I'm not sure. We could, if we really wanted to, we could go back through the 1860 census and count up everybody. Although, as Mokena was not yet incorporated at the time, the census was just of Frankfort Township. So Frankfort, Mokena, and what today we would call Frankfort Township was all just kind of lumped into one thing. But if I had to sort of guesstimate, I would place it at being pretty small, maybe around 200-300. The population of the town proper, at least. The entire population of Frankfort Township was probably still less than 1,000. Disaster struck on the unlucky date of Friday, August 13th, 1880, when a destructive fire broke out in their farmhouse. The blaze started a little after noon, and as it was the height of harvest season, help tamping the flames was scarce, but a fair amount of the McGovney's furniture and clothing were rescued. The entire house was completely ruined, but luckily no one fell victim to fire or smoke. By the following month, Elijah and his family were hard at work building a new house, and this structure, which rose out of the ashes, is likely the western portion of the current domicile on LaPorte Road. Danger in the form of fire visited the McGovney farm again in June 1883. This time, the tool house fell victim. The family was roused from their beds at 1 a.m., and by the time they rubbed the sleep from their eyes, the building couldn't be saved. Only by the dexterous efforts of Elijah and his sons could the conflagration be checked, but not before some embers had started another fire underneath a farm adjoining, which was also soon under control. Ominously, evidence on the scene pointed to the flames being the work of an arsonist. The McGovney family's time on the farm is tangible to this day, for aside from their farmhouse, which still stands triumphant, other improvements that came in this time, which now remain, were a chicken coop and brooder house, which likely date from the 1880s, alongside a well house and smokehouse, which were erected around the same time. McGovney also had a new windmill put up at the end of 1883, which is regrettably long gone. And this time, a persistent problem cropped up on the farm that any longtime Mokenian will be familiar with, namely the seasonal flooding of the northern edge of the fields that adjoin the village proper. On June 17, 1893, a special meeting of the mayor and board of trustees was called to address a petition that had been handed to them by Elijah and Kate McGovney. In it, the couple asked the village dads to contribute a share toward draining a slough that had formed on their property. The note went on to further claim that their lands are kept in bad condition by reason of wash and overflow from surrounding lands, including that which comes from territory inside of the limits of the village of Mokena. The board left the matter with the Committee on Public Property and Nuisances, which ruled at their next meeting that said slough would not stay there long enough to affect the sanitary condition of the village, and therefore the McGovney's request for help easing the financial strain of the flood was shot down. As Elijah McGovney got older, he began to slow down on the farm, and eventually moved to Chicago to live with his daughter Ada. In the meantime, his middle son Edward took over the agricultural responsibilities in Mokena. The younger McGovney was a tinkerer and gained a patent in 1905 for a contraption that picked bugs off spud vines. It also appears that an eastern wing was added to the McGovney farmhouse during Edward's time at the helm. His tenure is also marked by the third nasty fire in the farm's history, having taken place on August 5, 1911. This time, the alarm was sounded at 3 a.m. by eagle-eyed youth Herbert Hohenstein of Front Street, who spotted flames in the inky darkness across the fields south of his home. After Hohenstein's having called the Mokena telephone exchange, many villagers received word of the emergency and flocked to the farm to help. The fire was confined to two large tool sheds on the south side of LaPorte Road across from the farmhouse, and after the blaze was extinguished, the buildings were completely destroyed, and McGovney had lost a binder, corn planter, hay loader, hay press, plows, and other implements. Altogether, it was estimated that he had suffered a loss of about $2,000. No immediate cause was ever found for the disaster, and like a menacing ghost of the 1883 fire, it was guessed that the inferno was the work of an incendiary. Over the years, the problem with the so-called slough, or flooding of the northern half of the farm's fields, never really went away. However, in the World War I era, villagers made the best of it, as a Mokenian in February 1916 noted it to be a fine skating rink, which was being used by town youth every night. On March 3, 1921, in what would have been his 85th year, Elijah McGovney passed away peacefully at his daughter's home in Chicago. His mortal remains were transported back to his old Mokena home, where his funeral was held on the farm, being attended by a large number of old settlers, in the words of the village's news bulletin. Mourning quickly gave way to chaos, as disunion and animosity sowed themselves in the McGovney family in the aftermath of their patriarch's passing. That summer, Dick McGovney filed a suit in the Will County Circuit Court to break the will of his father, having charged that his siblings used fraud, misrepresentation, and coercion to compel their father to make the document. Furthermore, he declared that his father was not mentally capable of having made the will on his own accord when it was first filed in 1917, alleging that his brother Edward and sister Ada dictated the document, composed it, and forced their father to affix his signature to it. It took almost 2 years for the dust to settle, and the case being settled out of court between the heirs in March 1923. The entire McGovney farm, composed of 120 acres in all, was sold at auction on Saturday, December 8th, 1923. The high bidder was Elijah and Kate McGovney's youngest son, George, who forked over $130 per acre, or about $2,000 in modern funds. For reasons that have long since been lost to time, McGovney didn't keep the place for long, and he flipped it a year later. At this station in the timeline of history, we can close the book on the McGovney family and put it in its rightful spot in the Library of Ages. Let us now open a new volume and enter at this point the Yunkers, where a fresh sunrise begins.
Wow, Matt. So this is pretty significant. I mean, this is what we're talking about before, why McGovney's name is included, and the significance that they had and that their farm had on the town.
Yeah, definitely.
So George McGovney bought the farm, and then just a year later decides to flip it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing known about what might have caused that or what the reason for that would be?
No, not really. Nothing that I've ever been able to find. But yeah, he spent the money to buy the whole farm at the auction in 1923, but he barely held on to it, yeah.
And in today's dollars, he paid, it was roughly about $240,000.
Wow. Yeah, nothing.
And then that was kind of, do we ever hear any more about the McGovney family after that?
Yeah, the McGovneys, so not descendants of this branch of the family, Elijah and Kate. Well, actually, I am mistaken. Okay, I'm going back. Elijah and Kate McGovney's oldest son, Walter McGovney, or Dick McGovney, as he was always known, lived in Mokena for the rest of his life. He lived to be almost 100 and passed away in 1958. And he was the last member of his immediate family to live in Mokena, although he did have aunts, uncles, and cousins who also were McGovneys who lived in town. And we still do have one McGovney family member who lives in town today, but she is from a different branch of the McGovney family. And Dick McGovney was quite an interesting character. We could probably do a podcast on him someday. He lived for many, many years in the village calaboose or jail, one-room jail, just like a shack of a building that he bought in 1916 and converted over into his house. He was a lifelong bachelor.
How big of a property was this?
Very small.
I've seen the picture. It doesn't look very big.
He had a few acres to himself that actually was a little slice of his parents' farm. He lived over on what today would be the eastern edge of the Mokena Park District on the south side of LaPorte Road.
Okay.
In his calaboose. In fact, his driveway still exists. It is now a driveway that leads south of LaPorte Road, sort of on the border between the park property and the Methodist Church's property. And if you follow that little road, you come back to kind of like a garage where the Park District keeps some stuff, and that's where Dick McGovney lived back there. After having been in the McGovney family for 83 years, Fred and Carrie Yunker acquired the farm in 1924. Born Friedrich Junker, spelled with a J, on the day after Christmas 1869, to parents of sturdy Swiss origin, the new owner was a native of Orland, who, along with the rest of his family, eventually anglicized the spelling of their last name to spell it with a Y. Called an enterprising agriculturist and horseman by those who knew him, Fred Yunker tied the knot with Carrie Koppel, a member of a long-established Mokena family, in the spring of 1913. The couple came to make their home on the old Holstein farm on today's LaPorte Road at the well-known S-curve, where they made their living working the land and tilling the soil. Their time spent there would likely remain dearest in their memory, for it was here that their union was graced by the birth of their only child, Edwin Walter Yunker, on March 13, 1918. After Fred and Carrie Yunker first set down their stakes on the old McGovney place in 1924, they had the stately dairy barn from the Holstein property moved east down LaPorte Road to its new home, setting it down atop a limestone foundation dating from an earlier era. It still remains today as robust as the day it was moved. The Yunkers made other improvements to the property during their years here, making the farm uniquely theirs. A cattle shed and hog house were built around 1940. 3 open-wire corn bins were added in 1945, along with a corn crib 5 years later, which, like the dairy barn, all still stand. While growing up on his family's farm, Eddie Yunker attended Mokena schools, where he would become a star player on the basketball team. He and his family weathered the Great Depression with the rest of the village, and were known to help other Mokenians who weren't as fortunate as they were in this dark chapter of our history. The Yunkers generously gave to the family of Mabel Krapp when they could, a local mother raising 2 children on her own. Her young daughter, Laverne May, would often travel from her home on Wolf Road to the Yunkers to visit and accept what the Yunkers could humbly send her way. In doing so, she formed a tight connection with Eddie, and the two were married in the spring of 1940 in Laverne's Mokena home. Like countless young men of his generation, Eddie Yunker was summoned to the army during World War II, but Uncle Sam ultimately felt he'd be more useful to the country's efforts if he stayed on the farm, feeding the men and women in uniform, rather than marching with them. During the war years, Eddie and Laverne would bring their 2 sons, Lee and Ron, into the world. In April 1948, Fred and Carrie Yunker retired and moved to town, settling in a new home they had built on Mokena Street. A new epoch was heralded when Eddie and Laverne inherited the farm not long after the passing of Fred Yunker in 1949. As was the case since day one, the Yunker farm was in a slow but constant state of transformation, with a garage workshop being completed in 1960, along with 2 doghouses the same year. A new tool and implement shed was completed around 1965, and a metal shed on the south side of LaPorte Road was added in 1975. Among his many hats worn in Mokena, Eddie Yunker helped found the Village Park District in 1959 and served on its board of directors from its inception until 1975. He also had a chair on the board of Mokena Elementary School, District 159. To top things off, the Yunkers were active members of St. John's Church. To know Mokena was to know the Yunker farm. This author can reach back into his memory and recall being delighted as a child by the sight of Eddie's many dairy cows in their pasture, and can also easily remember what little traffic there was on LaPorte Road in this time, occasionally being halted as the farmer would lead his herd across the road back to their home on the north side of the thoroughfare. It was also not uncommon to see Sailor, the Yunker border collie, chasing cars on LaPorte Road. Craig Yunker, a Mokena resident and Eddie and Laverne's grandson, started out helping his grandfather around the farm by hunting rodents, all the while receiving a bounty of $0.10 per mouse and $0.25 for every rat. He eventually became Eddie's right-hand man, which was a full-time job in itself, and fondly remembered by Craig that it couldn't have been a better childhood out there in the fresh air. His cousin, Lisa Wells, paints a vivid picture of their grandparents. Her grandfather was a man of few words, but when he spoke, she remembers that he commanded attention. He was a farmer of the old school, a man who was able to do parts of the job that would easily rebuff those not accustomed to them, and simply accepted them as facts of farm life. Eddie Yunker was very patient, extremely kind, and very smart, but was also possessed of a keen sense of humor, as Lisa recalls that he loved to tease and joke around. Those who took part in Eddie's dairy milking demonstrations readily relate how he would squirt visitors from the cow's udder when they least suspected it. Craig Yunker related that his grandfather was a man of class and never said a bad word about anybody. He was a man of great height, standing in at a regal 6'2", and as Lisa Wells related to the author, he had huge hands. His fingers were the size of bananas. Laverne Yunker is remembered as a talker, a lady whose family was everything to her, one whose passion was cooking and baking. She kept a huge garden behind the farm's silo, one that was brimming with produce such as squash and zucchini. Lisa Wells remembers the stream of visitors that always seemed to be stopping at the farmhouse, where her grandparents treated everyone as a friend, offering all food and drink, turning away no one. In this same vein is the way the Yunkers opened their farm to area youth. Craig Yunker recalled how his father Ron's position as a history teacher at Lincoln Way brought him into contact with a fair number of troubled youths from the community. Ron Yunker came to be a mentor of sorts, offering the teens places to work on the family farm in Mokena, where Eddie and Laverne welcomed the opportunity to teach them. After Ron Yunker's untimely passing in 1987, Craig well remembered the dozens of kids who approached him to tell of how his father and grandparents had changed their lives.
It really paints a great picture of the kind of people that the Yunkers were.
Yeah, absolutely.
To look out for people and to try to help those that were in need. And interesting that Ron Yunker was a teacher, a history teacher at Lincoln Way.
Yeah, he was. And his brother Lee was a teacher too. I believe Lee was a math teacher, although I don't believe at Lincoln Way. But yeah, both the Yunker sons grew up to become teachers. Yeah.
And so Ron unfortunately passed away in 1987.
Yes.
And then unfortunately Craig Yunker passed away this year in 2022.
Yes, he did.
I love that you got to include so much of Craig's view and take on the farm and his grandfather. And yeah, I knew him for a long time as well. And the last time I spoke to Craig, he talked about his grandfather and the time he spent being on the farm as clearly some of his highlights of his life. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
It's great to have those included as well.
Animals played a huge role in life on the farm. The Yunker cows are remembered as docile creatures, but the bulls had a fiery meanness to them. Lisa Wells says this is best exemplified by the time Eddie entered their enclosure and one charged him, knocking the pitchfork from his hand that he carried for protection. As the bull went in to attack again, Bimmy, a rough-around-the-edges dog of Lisa's that had been sent to live on the farm, sprang into action. He jumped up and fiercely latched onto the bull's tail with his jaws, allowing Eddie to escape. She calls the dog's rescue of her grandfather nothing short of divine intervention. Craig Yunker remembered his grandfather's heart for animals and how he would tear up whenever a calf would be stillborn. There was also the time Sailor, the Yunker border collie, was stolen from the farm. Eddie searched high and low for his companion but found no trace of him and was absolutely heartbroken. One day a few months later, a neighbor called Eddie out of the blue and relayed the news that Sailor was back and had been seen in the pasture. The farmer hurried to the spot, and the dog immediately came to Eddie, despite being underweight. From then on, he never needed to be chained up, as he never left his master's side. Lisa Wells says, Grandpa was so happy and relieved to have him back. It was never resolved who took Sailor or where he was in his absence. As the years passed, and the other farms in Mokena became unceremoniously swallowed up by development one by one, Eddie and Laverne's farm stood out like a beacon in the night. As time went on, they fended off developers who offered them astronomical sums for the property. They could have lived like royalty in their final years by taking any of these offers, but instead the Yunkers chose to give the farm, the scene of so much of their love and labor, to all of Mokena. In 1997, Eddie sealed a deal on the farm with the Mokena Park District, in the understanding that it be kept up for future generations of villagers to enjoy and learn from. All was sealed with a handshake, as he was an honorable man and his word was his deed. Laverne Yunker, who had been a mother figure to so many in Mokena, passed away in 1995, and Eddie kept working the farm until his last harvest in the fall of 1997, when his second cousin Richard Erickson helped him do the work. Eddie Yunker crossed the great beyond at the age of 83 on July 22, 2001, a date which marked the end of an era. Through the tireless efforts of Mokenean Jen Medema, the McGovney-Yunker Farm was officially added to the National Register of Historic Places on May 31st, 2006, after she spent 2 years laboring on the immense nomination project. As the farm is such a prominent place in our town, the Yunkers, especially Eddie, have taken on an almost larger-than-life status in the community. Craig Yunker summed it up perfectly when he said that being with his grandfather was like working with Paul Bunyan. He was so strong and tough. The onus of preserving the farm, this wondrous historical treasure, is in the hands of the Mokena Park District, its current owner. All Mokenians with love in their hearts are looking to them in fervent hope that the Yunkers' wishes are carried out. Their responsibility is big. If any piece of the farm were to be removed from the landscape, no replica could ever take its place. Eddie and Laverne were the last of their kind, and our community owes it to their memory to keep and preserve their farm. Let us remember Proverbs 22:28. Remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set.
Wow, what a story.
Yeah, it is. It's a pretty good one.
Let's look back a little bit. You said Laverne Yunker passed away in 1995.
Yes.
And then 2 years later, Eddie has his last harvest on the farm.
Absolutely.
And then where does he live on the farm until his passing?
Yeah. He lived on the farm all the way up until his final days. He took ill with, I believe it was cancer. And he had a live-in caregiver, in his final days. But yeah, he was on the farm to the last.
And do you remember 2001 when he passed away?
Yeah, I do. It was big news in the Lincoln Way Sun, which was the newspaper we had at the time. I mean, it was Eddie Yunker's passing was big enough news in Mokena to have been right there on the first page of the paper.
Wow.
When I mentioned in here that he and Laverne were kind of like larger than life characters. Yeah, they really were. I can recall very well when he passed away and the huge turnout that came to his funeral.
Do you know where, was it at a church? Was he part of a church in the community, or? Yeah,
the Yunkers, Eddie and Laverne, their family, they were members of St. John's in Mokena, yeah. And they were both buried over in St. John's Cemetery here on Wolf Road. If I'm not mistaken, once again, the Yunker family members out there will correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe Lee and Ron, their sons, are buried there too, I believe. Could be wrong about that, but yeah, I think it's the whole family plot up there. So,
and then we fast forward a couple years to May 31st of 2006, when the farm is added to the National Register of Historic Places by the work of Jen Medema.
Sure.
Which, if you have not looked over the application packet that goes with, I know Matt has. I'm just saying.
Oh yeah.
It is very interesting, and there's a lot of really good pictures taken by Jen. And actually, the picture that we use for the podcast is one of her pictures from the registry that we alter a little bit of the McGovney-Yunker front porch there of the farmstead. I really enjoyed this story. I remember seeing it when you first published it, and really enjoyed it then. So I'm glad we got to do this early on in the podcast. Anything else, Matt, that you think you want to add?
I hope that we can keep up the farm for future generations. When Mr. Yunker sort of transferred his property over to when he sold it to them, he really wanted it to become a place where future generations could learn about farming, could learn about the lifestyle, and just all the stuff that comes with that. And I hope that that's something that we can have in the community, so that not only so that his wishes are fulfilled, but also so that today's generation and future generations can learn about what life was like here for so many years. It's really an important thing, and hopefully we don't lose touch with that, or lose grasp of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, very well said, and thank you for this wonderful article.
Absolutely.
It's hard to imagine what our village would look like today without the vision and forethought of Mr. Edwin Yunker, being vital in the creation of the Mokena Park District, in addition to his involvement in the Mokena schools and his church community. This original article, written by Matt, was published on March 19th, 2021, and can be found on his blog, oldmokena.blogspot.com. We also have a link to his article in our show description. Be sure to check out the wonderful photos Matt includes, as well as all of his great articles. If you are enjoying our podcast, please share it with your friends and family. We would also love it if you would leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Look for us on Facebook and Instagram by searching for Mokena's Front Porch. We share photos, interesting Mokena history aside from the podcast, and updates on upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, please email us at MokenasFrontPorch@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.